Martin Luther King. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about who Martin Luther King was and how his work changed the US. Within this presentation, you will hear some parts of speeches and quotes said by Martin Luther King himself. These have been obtained by wikipedia.com. General information. Today, Martin Luther King is acknowledged as one of the most important figures that have ever lived. But who was this man? Martin Luther King was born January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. He was an American Baptist priest and an important figure in the civil rights movement. He is mostly known for working to achieve equal rights for blacks and whites in the US. Martin Luther King was the son of Martin Luther King Sr. and Alberta Williams King. He was the family's third child between his older sister and younger brother. King was a good student. He jumped over both 9th and 12th grade and entered Morehouse College at the age of 15. There he took a degree in sociology and later started at his degree in theology. His work. Martin Luther King worked hard to make his dream come true. He was against using violence to get through to people and only used peaceful methods. This way of protesting he had got from one of his greatest idols, Mahatma Gandhi. I'm going to talk about more in that later. One of King's peaceful protests included a bus boycott in Montgomery. The background for the bus boycott was the fact that blacks and whites were segregated in the buses. While the blacks sat in the back, whites sat in the front. If a white person needed a seat, the blacks would have to give their seat up. The bus boycott included many important figures from the civil rights movement, like Martin Luther King himself and Ralph Abernathy. 14 October 1964, Martin Luther King was given the Nobel Peace Prize for his work to abolish ethnical difference with nonviolence. In the years that followed, he expanded his focus to poverty and the resistance to the US involvement in the war in Vietnam. Inspiration. In 1959, King visited Mahatma Gandhi's birthplace. King had, since he was a student, been inspired by Gandhi and his non-violence fight. The trip to India affected and increased King's understanding of non-violence resistance and his commitment for America's fight for civil rights. In a radio speech at his last night in India, King reflected, and I quote, "Since I have been in India, I have been more convinced now than ever that non-violence resistance is the most powerful weapon for oppressed people in their fight for justice and human dignity. Mahatma Gandhi embodied in his life universal principles that are inseparable in the moral structure in the universe, and these principles are just as unavoidable as the law and gravity." Civil rights activist Bayard Rustin was King's most respected advisor and was the one that advised King to use Gandhi's non-violence principles. Bayard Rustin had studied Gandhi and was King's mentor in the early years of his activism. Death and after effect. April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was killed by James Earl. The assassination led to a massive wave of riots all over the US, including in Washington, D.C., Chicago, Baltimore, Louisville, Kentucky, Kansas, and many more cities. President candidate Robert F. Kennedy was on his way to Indianapolis when he was informed about King's death. This resulted in that Robert Kennedy held a speech to a group of followers to make them keep King's work going and continuing his ideal with nonviolence. After King's death, other civil rights activists promoted King's nonviolent ways. Not everyone believed in King's work, like for example militant Stokely Carmichael. He believed in a more powerful reaction to the assassination of King. President Lyndon B. Johnson announced April 7th to a national day of mourning. After wishes of King's widow, King's last speech was played during his funeral at Ebenezer Baptist Church. The speech was named Drum Major and originally held February 4, 1968. In this speech, King asked that his funeral would not contain any of his achievements or prizes that he had earned through his life. He wanted to feed the hungry, dress the naked, be right in the question about Vietnam, and love and earn humanity. King's good friend Malia Jackson sung in his funeral, "Take my hand, precious Lord." The assassination of King led to a string of happenings. As I mentioned before, it led to riots all over the US, but it also led to one of King's last dreams to come true. He wanted to build a quarter for the poor. This dream of King had been criticized and people had showed that they did not support the idea. After the death of King, people's minds changed. The SCLS got many donations to make King's wish come true. The campaign officially started in Memphis in Tennessee, at the hotel where King was killed. Impact on the US. The impact King had on the society comes first of all from his vision. His vision was based on a society where which race one came from was not an issue in how that person were treated and how they would live their life. Sadly to say, his vision has not completely come true, but we can safely say it has affected the world. The work King and those like him did changed both the country and the world, for better in many noticeable ways. His vision made the world a more equal place and gave minorities around the world a voice. King was also responsible for the passing of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. These laws gave the African Americans the same rights as the whites. It literally made it illegal to treat African Americans different from the whites. These two victories had a huge impact on the US and the world. Conclusion. Martin Luther King can be known as a man beyond his years. He envisioned something that many during this time period didn't. He saw a possibility of change that would give minorities around the US and the world an important voice. King saw the hatred, oppression, and the want for freedom was still apparent through the country. Instead of waiting for change to happen, King took matters in his own hands and sparked a revolution that the world had never seen before. King was inspired by a dream that evolved into a powerful movement. The task he had given himself would at this time seem impossible. Although he was bombarded with negative feedback, he still strived to see his dream come to light. It is important to know that King's dream had been present before, but never successful due to strict laws that have been created by the Southern officials in the past. King proved himself to be a great visionary, and his work impacted the world in a huge scale. Sadly, King never saw his dream come in effect and passed away before it. To end this presentation, I would like to quote something King said. "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character." Sources.